In my opinion, Kendall Berg's personal opinion, if you are a bad employee, you are bad in the office and you are bad remote. You might be slightly worse remote because there's nobody watching you. So like you're not keeping your computer awake the same way when you're at home that you would be in the office. But like a bad employee is bad in either place. I think a good performer generally is actually better remote. If you are a hard worker with autonomy who is self-driven and owns their space, you are going to kill it remote, most likely. Now, this is excluding the introvert comment that I made at the start of the episode where I think it is easier to be an introvert in an office, okay? But if you're a high performer, you're going to be a high performer remote or in office. And so I think what happens is these executives get in their head like, oh, we have some low performers. They're not logging on. They're not doing well. I want to bring people back to office because there is a proximity thing where like if you sit next to a high performer, you become a better performer because you're surface level competing with them basically. And so I think people think, oh, we'll get them in the office and all these low performers will become better performers. The reality is like in my personal experience, I don't really see that happen very often. What I see is like a low performer becomes like marginally better and my high performers become less productive because they're frustrated. It's my 2 cents. Welcome back to this episode of Secrets of the Career Game. So many people are trying to navigate a corporate world that is laden with secrets, cleverly hidden, and unspoken rules to a game that most employees don't even know that they're playing. On this podcast, we try to give you a peek behind the curtains and some tips and tricks to ultimately make you successful in your career and help you progress a little bit faster. Welcome back, lovelies, to another great episode. I'm super excited about today's topic. It has been requested by many of you as it seems to be a common theme right now. Today, we are going to be talking about return to office. So a lot of companies over the last 5 years since COVID peaked and everybody kind of went remote unless you're a first responder. If you're a first responder, we appreciate you and your service. And then slowly companies have slowly been bringing people back. So first it was 1 day a week, then it was 3 days a week. Now some companies are 5 days a week all in, like the Amazons and the JP Morgan Chases of the world. And so return to office is a big topic right now. And I think selfishly, if you have followed me for a while, I am a huge fan of remote work. Right. For me, it is a big priority in my life to be able to work from home. There's a few reasons for that we'll kind of go into today. But as somebody who has worked in corporate for a long time, I've worked for really big companies. I've worked for more medium to small size companies. I do think there are benefits of returning to office in certain situations, which is what we're going to talk about today. Well, if you hate return to office and you're like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, I'm thinking about quitting my company, I don't want to go back. It's totally your prerogative. Like I said, I think there are a lot of benefits to remote work. Remote work works really well for me. The goal of this episode is not to change your mind and convince you that you should go back to the office, mostly because companies don't pay me enough to do that. Okay. But the goal of today's episode is to kind of talk through some of the pros and cons. So the pros of working in an office is one, if you are introverted and you don't like to speak up on calls, speaking up virtually and interrupting people or speaking over people is really uncomfortable for you, it is much easier to build relationships and establish a reputation for yourself in an office. The reason that I say this is because the environment's just much more casual, right? Your boss walks by, hey, I was going to go grab a coffee from the break room. Do you want to come with me? Now you're talking, and it's less pressure than being on a call with 30 people and feeling like you have to speak in order to make sure that your presence is known. And so I do think for introverts, in some ways, being in an office is actually easier because networking plays such a big role in career progression, career advancement, visibility, having high visibility projects and being well known across an organization. Virtual networking is very uncomfortable for most people. It is very awkward to message somebody who you don't know at all or very well and say, hey, I'd really love to chat with you for 15, 30 minutes. Can I grab some time on your calendar? There's some people this comes very natural to that falls more in that extrovert category. But so if you're introverted, you could find networking remotely really uncomfortable, right? Because it requires putting you very far out of your comfort zone and requesting time with people with whom you have no pre-existing relationship, nor do you know their personality type. So in some ways, I do think being in an office as an introvert can help with the networking relationship building side of your career because it's just that proximity. So that's like the big first benefit that I see of going into an office is if you are more introverted, more soft-spoken, you can build a reputation and relationships a little bit more easily in that environment. The second benefit of going into an office, when everyone is co-located, when everyone is co-located, okay, is it makes collaboration easier. It makes innovation easier. You can do brainstorming sessions on a whiteboard physically in the office. You build better relationships with your team dynamics. And I'll give an example. Years ago, I worked for a very large company. I'm not going to use name for this, but my entire team was in a different country. Right? So my office, there was not a single person co-located with me. So I would drive to the office and I would sit on Zoom calls all day with my team in a different country, and then I would drive home. I don't think that that adds a ton of value, just being honest. But what I will say is because teams adjacent to my team were in my location, I did build much better relationships with like our managing director. I did build much better, broader relationships with other divisions for internal transfers. I ended up working on 3 different teams while I was at that company because being in the office gave me the opportunity to meet these individuals who were also in the office. And there was that team feeling. Like I said, even though nobody on my team was in my office, people who sat around me, we all started the same week. And so while we worked in different divisions, we all built really great relationships. We'd go to lunch together. We knew each other well. In fact, 2 of those individuals who used to sit near me at that company now work for me because our bonds were strong enough that I was willing to recruit them into positions I had available later on in my career. So the collaboration, team dynamics, teamwork piece of it, in my opinion, really only works when you're co-located, right? This is the frustration that I think a lot of people feel is like, hey, I'm driving into an office, my whole team is somewhere else, I sit on Zoom all day and then I drive home. That's really frustrating and really annoying, frankly. Just it doesn't add a ton of value. I joke there are companies that I've worked for where I have driven into the office to sit in my boss's office and take calls all day and then drive home and not talk to a single soul in the office. In that situation, I don't think return to the office is really adding much value. But like I said, even though in that big company, my team wasn't in my location, there were enough people close to my team in that location where I did still get a good team dynamic. I did learn to build relationships and network more effectively with people in other parts of the organization. I was able to collaborate on different types of projects, even though it wasn't relative to my core job. So again, pro of coming back to the office when you're co-located is you can have meetings in a boardroom. You can ideate, you can ask questions, which is going to kind of bring me to the third pro of being in office. If you are fresh out of college and or in your first 3 years in that type of role, okay, or if you are being onboarded to a new company, it is so much easier to get up to speed and learn what you need to do when you are able to look over somebody's shoulder, when you are sitting next to your boss, when you can walk to somebody's desk and ask them a question, when you can do side by sides. There is a ton of benefit in that. Now, again, this requires co-location. If I'm going into an office as a new employee and nobody I work with is in that office, I am not getting a better onboarding experience. There is no one for me to ask questions to. I can't look over somebody's shoulder. Then it loses a lot of its appeal. But when you are co-located, I do think, especially when you're fresh out of college, I learned so much in my first job in person. If you have been eagerly awaiting the Secrets of the Career Game book, it is officially available for pre-order. This book will go over 36 strategies for building success in your career. And honestly, is some of my best lessons, best templates, and best ways for you to start to get the success and the progression in your career that you deserve. If you do pre-order the book, make sure that you email a screenshot of your pre-order to thatcareercoach@gmail.com in order to be added to our top secret community. In that community, you'll have access to me as well as 2 live Q&A sessions when the book launches. You'll also get an extra early copy with the first chapter of the book for you to read ahead. Go to Amazon, find Secrets of the Career Game, 36 strategies for your career. Go ahead, place your pre-order and send us an email. I remember my first boss out of college, he was great. It was really his first time managing people. So we were a little bit of like each other's guinea pigs if I was learning the ropes of how to play corporate and he was learning how to manage people effectively. And I remember I had sent the same email to this executive, like, let's say 7 times of like, I really need your response to this. No response. I didn't know them personally. And he was like, get them a coffee, get here early and go sit at their desk and wait. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, that's so obnoxious and so uncomfortable. I'm literally just going to be sitting in their chair, like waiting for them to show up. But I did it. And I brought them a coffee and I was like, hey, I don't know how you take your coffee. So I brought you a black coffee. Here's some sugar. Here's some cream. I'm Kendall. I sit in this division. I had sent you some emails. I just want to come over and introduce myself and talk to you a bit. Oh my gosh, I had never gotten a faster response to an email, built a good relationship with an executive, was able to then go to them for lots of other things. I worked with their team really closely. So being in office allows opportunities like that of like, hey, I'm just going to straight up go to this dude's desk and get an answer to this question. It allowed my boss to coach me more effectively, right? He's like, hey, I'm not getting a response to an email. Well, if we're all remote, then I'm going to ping that person and say, hey, this person on my team emailed you. Can you respond to them? It's just a different dynamic as opposed to going to an office where my boss was like, this is on you. Go sit at their desk until you get something. And it was a really good learning experience for me of like a little bit of how to be a bull in a china shop, right? Of like how to like get the responses that you need. So I do think when you're early on in your career and you're still learning things, like I remember looking over somebody's shoulder to learn how to do a pivot table or how to manage an access database, right? Like that aged me. Don't judge me on that statement. But I do think there is a lot of benefits when you are more junior and you are co-located with your manager and your stakeholders and you can build those relationships. Now, what you're hearing as a theme through this whole thing is I firmly believe remote or return to the office work only works if you are co-located. I think if your whole team is in California and you live in New York and you're going by yourself into an office in New York, it's not gonna do what you want it to do. Um, and I think the third benefit, and this one is a little bit more agnostic, it's not as dependent on having people in the office with you, is return to the office. I do think creates a little bit better separation in your work life. There are lots of studies that show if you work from home, like the act of closing your laptop at the end of the day can help you disconnect. But I check my emails and I'm online so much more working remotely than I was in an office. Like you log on at 7 and you're like, oh, I'll just check my emails, clean my inbox before I go make breakfast. Or it's 9 o'clock at night and you're like, oh, I forgot to send that email soon. So I'll just log on and get it done now. And like you end up, I think, having a harder time separating your life from your work when you are at home all the time. My family recently had the flu and it was really terrible. If you had the flu this year, I'm so sorry. Like my husband was in the emergency room. My kids had 105 fevers. Like it was brutal. And I worked the whole time, even though for 2 weeks my kids are home from school. My husband is sick. I'm taking care of them. I didn't take a single sick day. Well, I took one single sick day. And otherwise I was taking care of them because there is no separation. Like I can take calls while my kids are napping, or I could take calls when my husband took his medicine. And I do think that that's a little harder. Whereas in the olden days, like I left my laptop at work. And if my whole family got sick and was home, I'm like, dude, I got to take a sick day. I'll catch up when I get back next week. And I would have disconnected completely. So I do think return to office creates a little more separation. I think it's easier for people to like recharge. I do think like I love a good commute. I know most people hate commutes. I actually like them because I listen to podcast episodes so I can like get my little podcast in. By the time I get home, I've kind of recharged. I've disconnected from work. I'm in a new environment. So these are some of the benefits of return to office, right? I think some of the negatives of return to office is if you are a parent, especially of young kids, but even parents of older kids, but if you're a parent or if you're caring for someone older in your family or in any way where you have dependents, there is such a convenience to remote work. And I think it gets a bad rep where people are like, oh, you're doing laundry on company time. If I throw all of my laundry in the laundry machine and press start, that took 30 seconds of my life. And then when it dings and I moved it to the dryer, 30 seconds of my life, I'm not folding and putting away laundry on company time. Usually I just don't have time. But that convenience of like, okay, great, now it's all done. And when I disconnect at 5, I can then fold it and put it away. Where if I'm driving from an office, then I'm not home till 6, then I got to eat dinner and then I don't want to do laundry because it's late. Blah, blah, blah. So I do think there's a lot of flexibility. I'm using housework as an example, but my kid's bus drops them off at 3:55 every day and I'm home. Now I'm working, but they can come home and go into their room. I don't have to put them in after school care. That is a huge benefit to me financially and just from a time co-located perspective with my family. So I do think if you are a caregiver of any kind, whether for kids or for older dependents, there is a benefit of working remote to getting stuff like that done. You have a 10-minute break in your meetings because something ends early and you can load the dishwasher. You can go for a walk. I do think that that is a big benefit of remote work. What I would say is the counter argument to this is like, oh, people are so lazy when they're working from home. They're doing all this other stuff. I would argue I wasted more time in an office than I do working remotely. Like maybe some of you guys can empathize with this, but that large company that I worked for had a Starbucks in our building. Dude, I went to Starbucks like 4 times a day. walking downstairs, getting some steps in, walking across the street, getting a little Starbucks. I run into somebody from marketing. Then we're chit-chatting for 15, 20 minutes. Then I'm walking back to my desk. Then I'm getting logged back in. Then so-and-so next to me is like, oh, you got a Starbucks? I was just thinking about going. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, I just went. I would have gone with you if I knew. Now we're chatting. 35 minutes has gone by because I wanted to go get a coffee. And I'm doing that 4 times a day. Then I'm taking a lunch break because I don't want to sit at my desk and eat because it's gross because you got somebody sitting right there. So then you're either eating in the break room or you're going out to lunch with people that you work with and you're gone for a full hour. So I would argue, like, when I was in the office, I worked so much less continuous hours. If you think Cal, Newport, deep work, continuous hours of engagement, I worked less in an office than I do from home. That's my personal experience, right? And so I think people are like, oh, well, she's doing housework or she did this. Like, dude, that is still way less time than I spent chit-chatting with Susie in accounting. I'm just saying, right? The other thing is, obviously, there is no commute. So it does give you more time back in your life. So like I said, I like a commute. I like listening to a podcast episode. I'm not against it. But I do think, like, waking up, making breakfast, like for me, I get my kids off to school. I can go for a little walk and I can still be online by 9. And then after work, I'm done working at 5 and I'm home. I can make dinner right away. I can take my kids to their sports activities. So it does give you a lot of time back, not spent in a car commuting to and from. For me, that's probably the biggest reason why I like remote work is, yes, I get a little bit of time back throughout my day. Yes, my team's not co-located, so there's not a ton of benefit of me going to the office. But the biggest thing for me is it's 2 hours of my life that I'm not in a car wasting time where I could be working out, where I could be cooking for my family, where I could be doing housework, where I could be decompressing, reading a book, painting by numbers, like whatever it is, right? So I do think that the benefit of a remote work is that lack of commute time. The other benefits that I would say remote work has is, in my opinion, Kendall Berg's personal opinion, if you are a bad employee, you are bad in the office and you are bad remote. You might be slightly worse remote because there's nobody watching you. So, like, you're not keeping your computer awake the same way when you're at home that you would be in the office. But, like, a bad employee is bad in either place. I think a good performer generally is actually better remote. If you are a hard worker with autonomy who is self-driven and owns their space, you are going to kill it remote, most likely. Now, this is excluding the introvert comment that I made at the start of the episode, where I think it is easier to be an introvert in an office. Okay. But if you're a high performer, you're going to be a high performer remote or in office. And so I think what happens is these executives get in their head like, oh, we have some low performers. They're not logging on. They're not doing well. I want to bring people back to office because there is a proximity thing where, like, if you sit next to a high performer, you become a better performer because you're surface level competing with them, basically. And so I think people think, oh, we'll get them in the office and all these low performers will become better performers. The reality is, like, in my personal experience, I don't really see that happen very often. What I see is, like, a low performer becomes, like, marginally better and my high performers become less productive because they're frustrated. It's my 2 cents. I think the other challenge for remote work in a culture perspective, so we're going to shift now. So I talked about some of the pros of being in the office, some of the cons, the pros of being work remote. We're going to talk now about the culture component. So from a culture perspective, I don't think managers are trained with how to manage people remotely effectively. Now, I've shared this stat from Forbes on my social media multiple times before, but, like, the average manager does not get any training on how to manage people until 11 years into managing people. That's usually when their first training is. So if you have a new boss and they suck, honestly, it's kind of not their fault. Like, nobody helped them, I promise. But I don't think especially managers are being trained on how to manage remote work environments. Most teams that I have managed, with the exception of 2, were fully remote. So for me, I really only know how to manage remote employees. In fact, in office, I'd probably be a less effective manager because I haven't done it as much. But when you think of managing remote employees, you need to set checkpoints, right? I talked about this a little bit on my project management episode. Like, checkpoints are the chef's kiss of, like, being a good manager of anything, project manager, people manager, it doesn't matter. Most managers make the mistake of either, I'm going to assign you something, it's due in 2 weeks, and we don't check in at all until that 2-week mark. Or I'm going to assign you something that's due in 2 weeks and I'm going to hound you and check in on you every 15 minutes till that happens. Either one is not a good option. Checkpoints are king. So if I assign something that's due in 2 weeks, which would be 14 days, let's say 10 business days. At the 5 business day mark, I want to do a checkpoint. Hey, I want you to walk me through what you have, show me, we can deliberate it, we can make some tweaks, and then you've still got a week to implement those tweaks before the deadline. And then depending on how that 5-day checkpoint goes, maybe we checkpoint middle of the next week at like the 8-day mark just to make sure things are good to go. But if we were really close on the 5-day mark, I'm not going to waste your time. Great, turn it in 2 weeks, right? So checkpoints are really key, especially when you are remote. When you're in the office, your manager probably popped by and was like, hey, how's this thing going? And you're like, oh, it's good. Let me bring it up and I can show you. And there's more of that like natural checkpoint interaction. When you are remote, you have to schedule that. You need a calendar invite. Hey, I want a checkpoint on this. I want an update. My team has 3 checkpoints this week. And I actually messaged one of my managers earlier and was like, hey, we have 3 checkpoints this week. What are each of them for? Like, I know we have 3 things going on, but like, which checkpoint is which? And they were like, these are the descriptions of each. I was like, that's super helpful. Perfect. Thank you. Because we have so much going on right now. But for me, checkpoints make sure that I'm not going to forget to follow up on something and then it becomes a fire drill because it's last minute. Okay. I think managers who don't know how to manage in a remote environment, they don't do checkpoints. Okay. They don't have any type of task tracking. Now, I'm going to caveat task tracking. Do not ask your employees to track every single thing that they do. That is so exhausting. Dude, that is exhausting. But I have some themes that I ask my team to track. Like, hey, if you, let's say, process invoices, like every month, put a count of how many invoices you process, just so that like I can then go to my boss and be like, oh my God, this person just processed 300 invoices. Like that's a ton, right? I have some themes like that where we track counts or we track volumes. And then I have other things that are big projects where I want milestones, right? Because a lot of projects don't happen in a week or happen in a month. Now there's fire drill ones that do. But like my team, because we are virtual and I can't look over their shoulder and see what they're doing all day, nor would I want to, frankly. We have a digital tracker where every month I'm like, hey, go in here, update your status of all these things. If there's something new you're working on, add it to the bottom. This is big projects, big scopes, so that I can then, 1, know what my team is doing because I'm far away. I can't see their computer screen. 2, I can go to my boss and be like, look how great the team is. This is all the great stuff they did this month. Great. It helps me advocate on their behalf. And 3, it helps me self-advocate of like, here's the things I'm managing, right? I add my own tasks to those trackers so that I have visibility into what's going on and so that my team does as well. So I think remote managers don't know how to manage remote employees. They don't know how to track tasks. They don't know how to assign checkpoints. They don't know how to like manage the overall scope. And lastly, most managers do not like giving constructive feedback. And so what happens in a remote environment is if an employee is bad, okay, employee is bad and I don't give them constructive feedback. Hey, I need you to show more ownership. Hey, I need you to lean in on this. Hey, I need to make sure that you don't miss this. Hey, this is this deadline and you're missing it. If I don't give that constructive feedback to that person, they will atrophy and they are far removed. They have no connections to the company. They're not networking because they're a bad employee. And so they're just going to sit in a silo and essentially we're going to stop giving them work. And some people are fine with that. They're like, cool, I'll coast. I'll make my salary. I don't have to do much. I can go to the gym in the middle of the day, whatever. And some will quit, which is the ideal situation because then you can replace them with a higher performer, right? I think the problem with most managers in a remote environment is we're not setting checkpoints, we're not tracking tasks, and we're not giving constructive feedback. So people end up becoming worse employees because they're not getting the training and coaching that they need. All of that is to say, is if you are a manager and you are managing remote people, you need to learn to adjust your style. And I think that's where we're getting this big push of return to office. Executives and senior leaders have been managing people in person for 25, 45 years, right? They only know on-site engagement, on-site collaboration, on-site people management. That's a comfort for them. And use the phrase teaching an old dog new tricks. They don't want to learn how to manage people remotely. And so for them, it's easier to say, hey, let's come back into the office where everything I know how to do will continue to work. And you guys can all be here and I can get stuff done. And they're co-located with their most important people. It's a push, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it requires a lot of adjustment to learn to manage remotely. I've had some great bosses working remotely. My boss currently, he and I have met twice. I have worked for him for 4 years, but he does a great job of assigning work. We have 2 checkpoints a week on all these different things. We have a clear priority list. He and I have strategy sessions twice a year. Like we are very in sync, but it requires intentionality and it requires time investment, right? Same with my team. I meet with my team, my direct reports every other week, and my extended team has one-on-ones once a month. Plus we have team meetings. Plus we have strategy sessions every year, right? And that's to keep them engaged. But again, it has to be intentional. So I think that that's a big shift. The last thing that I'll say on remote work is going to be the candid, direct Kendall version, which is most of these companies want you to come back to office because they either own or lease those buildings and they want the real estate tax credit. Okay, let's all be honest. They want bodies in that office so that they're not spending a bunch of capital that they're never going to get back, so that they can get the tax credit, etc. Right? So this was a big thing in 2020 in New York because New York gives a certain tax credit, but it has an occupancy requirement. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time, but they have an occupancy requirement, meaning you have to have a certain number of bodies in the office. And if you're a remote employee and I'm claiming on my taxes that this is my office, New York can't claim me in my high-rise building as my office. So like the company no longer gets that tax credit. I get that tax credit as the individual. So there is I'm investing capital and I want it to be worth it. And the tax credit component to all of this, again, that's state by state. I'm just speaking about New York because that's what I'm most familiar with. But there is a factor of the companies like, hey, I own all this real estate. I want there to be bodies in it. And I get that. I mean, if you owned a house and your kids insisted on having sleepovers 10 days a week at everybody else's house, obviously there's not 10 days in a week, you know what I'm saying? They're all gone every week. You're like, dude, what am I paying for your room and buying you food and you're never here? That's why most people who are empty nesters downsize because they don't want to pay for this giant house that then nobody's living in, right? Okay, let's all be honest with ourselves. So this whole episode, like I said, is not to say that like return to office is a bad thing. And it's not to say that work from home is a good thing. But there are pros and cons to both. So if you're the type of person like me where you're like, I really do not want to go back to an office, remember that there are benefits that your company is trying to enact, right? They're trying to create community. They're trying to create team dynamics. They're trying to create collaboration. They're trying to make onboarding better. They're trying to do all these things so that your experience with the company is a more positive one. Now, if you are an extroverted high performer, it's probably not as beneficial for you because you're like, dude, I don't need this. But if you're an introvert, there is a benefit. I hate to say it. If you're a low to medium performer, there is benefit. If you're fresh out of schooling, there is a benefit. If you're trying to manage people for the first time, it's easier for you to manage people in person the first time than it is longer term, right? So there are benefits to going back to the office. I just think that companies are not thinking about the bigger picture, right? Once you start granting exceptions, this person doesn't come in, this person doesn't come in, this person doesn't come in, or this person's in a different state. Now we're not all co-located and a bunch of those benefits decrease. And yet we're still pushing for this return to office because some executive and his 5 most relevant people are all in the same location. Right. So I think that's where the miss is. But I'd be curious to hear you guys' thoughts on remote work. If you're interested in this topic, give us 5 stars, leave your comments and your questions down below or your opinion. I'd love to hear where you guys fall on the spectrum of return to office versus work from home versus hybrid, somewhere in between with like a few days in office. Love to hear your perspective. Otherwise, come back next week and we will have another great episode.